Kia ora koutou. Yeah, I'm self-quarantined over there, and we're hoping that I've got 2 glasses of water up here, and we're hoping my voice is going to last half an hour. Let's go. So I'm going to talk about 3 things today. I'm going to talk about the past 150 years, using historical and descriptive epidemiological methods, very briefly, the long-run history. Then I'm going to talk about the past 30 to 40 years, and here I'm going to introduce you just to one example of a recent blossoming of methods in both economics and epidemiology using counterfactual and potential outcomes approaches. How many people before coming along today had heard of the potential outcomes approach? Yeah, okay, so by the end of the day you'll be able to raise your hand. I'm not going to go into detail, but I want you to know these things exist, so when some smart young student comes along, you can say, oh, I could make use of that. And I'm going to use those methods to answer questions about what causes the differences in mortality between Māori and non-Māori, focusing on socioeconomic position and smoking. And then you've probably worked out by now what number 3 was. It's going to be the future, which will lead nicely into Barry's talk, who'll be exclusively on the future. I'm going to use examples of the simulation models we do in Bode to estimate out to the future. All right, part 1. Based on a book that myself and Alistair Woodward wrote, absolute bestseller, I'm sure you've all read it, 2014, go buy it. But there's some good news. Well, it's not so good news and good news. So go from top to bottom, we have non-Māori female, non-Māori male, Māori, actually it changes over, you will have astutely noticed. Which one's the pointer? That's the pointer. So you see there's a swap over here, but by the time you get to here, that's Māori female and Māori male. There are obviously huge gaps, y-axis life expectancy, huge gaps in life expectancy in the late 19th century. But things are improving. Actually, if you draw these lines out, by 2040, 200 years after the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, they may actually come together. We may actually see no difference between Māori and non-Māori. Now, it's not just going to happen by people like me sitting around saying that's the statistical trend. It's going to happen by ongoing policy activity. You'll notice a couple of other things. You'll notice a couple of other things here, is that there's flattening in here for non-Māori. That flattening there is the peak of the cardiovascular disease epidemic. You'll also notice there's flattening in here for Māori. That may be a delayed peak of the cardiovascular disease epidemic, but I also think it's unmistakable that it's in part due to neoliberal reforms and high unemployment rate. That's as much as I'm going to say about that today. Now, this slide just makes a point that you probably all know. This slide decomposes the increases in life expectancy over time by ethnicity and sex by age group. And what it's simply showing is that back around World War II, is that the gains in life expectancy were largely amongst kids. It was the young people's falling mortality rate that was driving increases. And then you're getting up to 65-plus-year-olds by about the 1980s. And now the game's on at the older age groups. This is a black and white reality, is that the increases in life expectancy, if that's how you count health, are more driven now by what happens at older ages. It doesn't mean to say that what you do with kids doesn't matter. It will matter for 2 reasons. You may value, as a society, the child obesity rates and want to do something about them, even if that's not going to affect life expectancy for ages, which is the second point, is that intervening young may be the best way to change these long-term trends into older age, although I know Rod's going to be provocative about that later today, and I empathise with his provocativeness. I'm going to need water already. Those of you who know me, normally I'm a very enthusiastic speaker. I'm trying, I promise. This slide is about something called period effects. On the y-axis is mortality rates on a log scale, and for each single age group. So the higher the line, so these lines up here are the older people. And it's just plotting that age group's mortality rate over time. Now, there's one point I'm putting this up for, is to demonstrate that about 1970, those lines turned amongst middle age and old people together and started coming down. That's called a period effect. It's not the fact that different birth cohorts are coming through with different mortality risk going forward in time. They all turned together. Because what happened in society at that time was you were starting to reduce your saturated fat. Yes, Rod, I got that in for you. reduced smoking rates, and everybody turned together. A lot of what happens over our history of mortality decline is probably period effects as opposed to cohort effects. And you can see it in this graph here, so the red line really catches your eye, and I am stunned at the number of public health audiences I speak to who do not know the following truth. That red line has fallen 80%. Cardiovascular disease mortality rates standardised for age have fallen 80% in New Zealand and every other high-income country since circa 1970. You will often hear people bleating on the radio about how things are going to hell in a handcart. Well, actually, a lot of things are going quite well. Our life expectancy is increasing. Yes, there are still inequalities. Cardiovascular disease is coming down. But as the population lives longer, that cardiovascular disease moves to older ages, so you'll still get a lot of gains out of that. But there is some good news in here. And even things like the cancer mortality are coming down. Now, it's a mixed bag with things like colorectal cancer. It's just starting to turn. But we've got soft tissue cancers and hematopoietic ones which are going up. But not today. We'll deal with that another time. And the last slide, looking at history, leads into my next section, which is looking at the tobacco trends. So the top line is the total number of cigarette equivalents, and it's plummeted per capita since circa 1970. We still have a long way to go. We need a lot more effort to achieve our tobacco-free goal of less than 5% by 2025. So that's a bit of context looking in the rear vision mirror. Now we're just going to look in the rear vision mirror for a little bit of distance and look at the last 30 to 40 years, and I'm going to introduce you to this thing called counterfactual or potential outcomes approach. And it's all just been published in a journal called Epidemiology, pretty difficult journal to get published, and the methodological impetus here is fierce. I've never had such hard peer reviews as this paper. By context, I showed you the smoking rates coming down, and of course you know that the smoking rates are much higher for Māori. So Māori in orange, European other in purple. We'll put aside Pacifica for today, just don't have enough data to do the tricks I want to do next. So this is a slide borrowed from my good friend and colleague John Lynch. We teach advanced epidemiology together a couple of times a year. And he likes to, I think it's very good, he likes to position epidemiology as having three tasks. First, we describe the distribution of outcomes. That's what I've just done. I've given you trends in mortality over time. It's descriptive epidemiology. It's good stuff. Then we also look at how does exposure affect outcome? So does smoking affect mortality? Well, we know that, but maybe does radon affect lung cancer rates as a harder one to answer. But then the interesting one for a lot of us at the moment is this one. M stands for mediator. It's a variable on a pathway. So the one we're about to look at is ethnicity being the exposure, going to mortality as the outcome, and M, the mediator, being things like income, education, and smoking as mediating variables. There has been a blossoming of methods in here. So thinking about Janine's talk beforehand, she showed you slides of parental education and the number of hours you read to your kid and the outcomes. So you could rethink that problem in terms of exposure being educational status of the parent, outcome being child's performance, and what would happen if we introduced an intervention in there in the mediator that changed the amount of reading and the style of reading? How much would that improve overall child functioning as well as change inequalities? That's the gig that we're into at the moment. And the potential outcomes approach is an imagining. It's a counterfactual world. It's whereby we think, what would happen if? And you have to do what Julia Pearl, brilliant book, The Book of Why, would call the level 3 of thinking, beyond trials and actually thinking counterfactually. So here's what we're going to look at. Ethnicity is the exposure, mortality is the outcome, socioeconomic status is the first set of mediators, and then smoking as well. Notice the red arrow. A lot of tobacco can be explained by your differences in income and education. And then there may be a little bit left over explaining the ethnic inequalities because ethnicity directly affects tobacco through pathways other than through education, labour force status, deprivation, yada yada. That's important. We'll come back to that in about 3.5 minutes. So we're going to look at these pathways here. So the first research question is how much of that historical inequality was due to SEP and tobacco combined, and because this is a life course conference and we've got amazing data, I've got 30 years of linked census mortality data, we can look at those trends over time. 6 different short duration cohort studies. Nobody in the world has been able to do this before with that amount of data on causal mediation analysis. Now, we use something called natural direct effects. Now, I get into trouble using the word natural because there is nothing natural about colonisation, racism, and all the forces that came to drive differences in ethnic groups and their socioeconomic status. However, The Harvard boys and girls who developed these methods call this natural direct effects, so that's what we've got. The next one is going to be what I call the hand of God. We're going to reach in there and we're going to change the mediator. This is incredibly relevant for you policymakers out there. This is the type of gig that us researchers can do, where we estimate the effect of reaching in there and changing that mediator, changing the amount of time the father reads to the kids, getting tobacco out, but not changing all the socioeconomic status and what will happen to ethnic inequalities. So this is the big one, this is the policy relevant one. So here's some Greek jargon for you. I'm going to go through this quite quickly. This is more for those people who are into a bit of geek stuff. A equals Māori equals exposed. A star is unexposed, which is European other. M is the value of the mediators for those who are exposed, for Māori. So M, without a star, is the value of socioeconomic status and tobacco for Māori. M star is the value of the mediators when unexposed. It's just a bit of jargon, but you'll see why it comes important in a sec. Now, we need to estimate 3 entities to pull this gig off, right? First one is the expected mortality risk for Māori with mediators. Māori would have had, well, that's bloody easy, it's just the observed mortality rate for Māori. No problems there. The next one is the expected mortality risk for European other with mediators. European other would have had it for their European. That's just the expected, no problem so far. Why is this guy talking about this fancy method? Here's the problem. We also need to think counterfactually and estimate the mortality risk for Māori, exposed in epi jargon, with counter to fact mediators at the values expected had the person actually been European other. Whoa. Hiya! Come here, that is a bit out of this world. No, Miss P, this is the Crossworld assumption. So this is the trick that we're using in this type of analysis, where we have to imagine something that doesn't really exist to answer the question about what happened in the past. And it's potential outcomes. You're thinking about the potential outcome, excuse me, had Māori actually had the level of SEP, socioeconomic status and tobacco, that European other had. It's a counterfactual way of thinking. So that's the Crossworld assumption. We don't need to go into too much detail on the methods today. I want to keep this up at the sort of results and what you can do about it. I just want you to know that these methods exist, and I'm just talking about causal mediation analysis. There are other things like G computation, where you can model people over time in a birth cohort, like growing up in New Zealand, and use these types of counterfactual methods as well to answer causal inference questions. And presumably you policymakers want to act on something that's causal, right? Not just something that's correlated. You're interested in causes? Yeah, presumably. That's the gig that we're in, and we're trying to provide that information. How do we estimate that cross-world entity? There are a number of ways. I'm not going to go through them all today. We're just going to use one where we flip a switch in a regression model. And how we're going to do that, this is the cross-world entity, is that we've got a whole bunch of things, and we've got some tricks in here. For example, in your boring old log link model, logistic regression plus on whatever, the rate ratio for smoking causing mortality amongst Māori is less than it is amongst European other. It's called an interaction. So we just throw all the interactions in there, yada yada. For those of you into computer science, there's a real opportunity in here for a bit of machine learning. If you want to do a PhD, come see me. So we select the logistic regression and we just predict the heck out of it. And then what we do is for the best model, so we've got non-Māori and we've got Māori in there. We've got a model predicting the mortality risk. And then the little trick that we do in here is that we then just take that whole regression model, we take the non-Māori and we flip the ethnic indicator to be Māori. We just make them 1 for the Māori one, because that will now be Māori with the mediators at the level of Europe. It's pretty simple, actually. So that's another key point, is whilst you may hear of these counterfactual and potential outcomes approach and they seem a bit daunting, it's just another method. You just walk through it and the steps aren't too hard. And we put on all these things, in particular here, the mediators, the ones to look at there. We've got education, income, this is all census, data linked to mortality, so cohort studies, neighbourhood deprivation and labour force status. Now, these blue bars are as follows: 0. Māori mortality rate, non-Māori mortality rate. See the gap between my hands? It's called a rate difference. Well, that blue bar is just the total effect in absolute terms. So the blue bar, now taken down to 0 here, is the gap between Māori and European other. And that's called a total effect in epi jargon. And then when we do the counterfactual thinking and we adjust for all the socioeconomic factors, the red bar is how much we explain away. And you can see it's sort of nearly 50% for males and not that much for females, and we'll come back to the percentages in a sec. And then you put in the tobacco. Those bright red bars aren't much higher than the pale red bars for males, but they're a little bit higher for females. And if we then put on there a secondary y-axis, so I'll show you how this works, this is percentage explained. So this is the percentage of the total blue bar that's explained by the light and then dark red bars here. And so you can see about 50% for males, constant over time. There's two interesting things about the females. First one is the contribution of socioeconomic status is increasing over time, which makes sociological sense. Post-World War II, more and more females going to the labour market, socioeconomic position having greater salience for females. The second one is that actually there is a, there is a jump up now for females in the contribution of tobacco. Now, I wasn't expecting to find that, but as soon as I saw it, I went, oh, that makes sense. Because, remember, in trade, at the time of James Cook onwards, Nari's nodding at me, is that tobacco was a big commodity. And unlike in most societies around the world where the high SES males take up smoking first, followed by the low SES privileged males, followed by the minority group males, followed by the minority group females, in New Zealand we had something peculiar where Māori females had high smoking rates from the get-go and have higher smoking rates than you'd expect just based on SES. So you see this extra contribution from smoking, from that direct pathway from ethnicity to smoking through mechanisms other than just through SEP. Cool. Now let's jump on to the one that you policymakers in the room are quite interested in. Now this is obviously an example which may be a little bit exaggerated, but you can use it for things like what Janine was talking about and changing the amount of reading time that kids do have with their father, say. These are the controlled direct effects of what I call the hand of God. That's not Maradona, that's me. Okay, so what we do now is we flip the switch in a different way. We now make everybody as though they're a never smoker in these regression models, and we pump out some numbers. I'm not going to get detailed. Now this is called who remembers hot chocolate from the 1970s? Everyone's a winner, baby. Yeah, Andrew does. My voice is so bad today that Andrew is going to sing it to us. No, he's not. But this is my everybody's a winner, baby, and it works like this. Māori mortality rate, non-Māori mortality rate observed, dark. Light blue is Māori mortality rate. I'll do it here so my hand's a bit steadier. Māori mortality rate had they never had smoking, European other mortality rate had they never had smoking, males. Same gig for females, so everyone's a winner. Everybody's mortality rate goes down. Cool. What happens to inequalities? Well, in an absolute sense, the absolute difference in height between the blue and the red bars, it drops from, you see the numbers there, but it drops by 15%. See that 15% there? For males, and it drops by 24% for, that's pretty good. A quarter drop in inequalities from one intervention to make New Zealand tobacco free. Fantastic. There's no other intervention that will achieve that amount of reduction in inequalities, maybe other than getting rid of all sodium chloride in New Zealand and replace it with potassium chloride. We'll come to that. I'm serious. But a lot of people want to see the relative inequalities go down, the rate ratio. The height of the blue bar divided by the red bar gives you the rate ratio. This is not so good. Look what's happening in here. You see that the rate ratio actually goes up for males and stays much the same for females. This is a common conundrum in epidemiology of health inequalities. It's a damn sight easier to reduce absolute inequalities than it is to bring down the relative inequalities as well. If we had nirvana, we'd bring down both the absolute and relative. Is it acceptable to us to not bring down the relative inequalities and just leave the absolute inequalities stable? I think at this point in time in history, where tobacco is such a big thing and obesity acting on those risk factors, if we don't see the relative inequalities come down, but we at least reduce the absolute inequalities, I'm in. But it's not going all the way to reducing both absolute and relative inequalities. Okay, so a summary of the past 30 to 40 years in one slide. Epidemiology is increasingly using these counterfactual and potential outcomes approaches. I have not showed you how to use them today, but I just hope you know the term now, and if you hear somebody talk about it, it's worth listening, it's worth finding the expertise. You know, Susan, you should be using this on the Growing Up in New Zealand study. I'm sure you're thinking about it. This is good stuff. Unsurprisingly, socioeconomic position tobacco explain much of ethnic inequalities, but with nuances. Empirically, about half of those inequalities, remember I explained away half of them? Well, actually, even though we've got fantastic data, it is just the box you ticked for your income in the last 12 months. It's not very well measured in the last 12 months, and it certainly ain't your income 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15. So you could do better to measure those mediators. Now, I would wager my house on the fact that it's more than 50%. It's probably up around 3/4. It will not explain all of it away, because we know that there are inequalities in access to health services through mechanisms of just brown versus white skin. There are other mechanisms that don't necessarily act through socioeconomic position. Now, I use the term natural effects there, and I want to make it very clear, I consider nothing natural about colonisation. I'm not trying to say those things don't exist. There are important sociological forces behind this that we could do another level of analysis on. Eradicating tobacco will improve everyone's mortality risk and lower absolute inequalities, but probably not change the relative inequalities. It's just the nature of life or death. And modelling in our BODE program, which I'm going to show you a few slides on the remaining 4 minutes I have, is consistent with this type of thing. So let's just finish up with some BODE modelling. So let's think ahead. I'm just going to show you some slides, snapshots. I'm not going to show you the methods. I'm just going to show you some snapshots of outputs from the BODE program. And what we do is we simulate out into the future. So one thing we do is we increase the tobacco tax by 10% per annum for each year until 2025. Seemed like fantasy only about 5 years ago, but it is actually what's happening, although the government is considering stopping that. So what effect would that have? So we model all this stuff through, and we work out that you would see, with a 3% discount rate for the entire New Zealand population live in 2011, something like 53,000 QALYs gained. How big is that? It's hard to imagine how big that is without some context. Well, if you actually got rid of tobacco immediately in 2011, you would get 15% of that health gain just with the tobacco tax increase. That's not bad. So 15% of all potential health gain that can be realised for doing things on tobacco can be realised just with the tobacco tax. So that's quite good. There are other things like the equity for people who continue to smoke and the income effects and all that stuff, but for now we'll just focus on this. Now here's the good news. Because Māori have higher smoking rates, because Māori have higher cardiovascular disease and lung cancer rates, because, you actually get a lot more per capita QALY gain for Māori than non-Māori. It's about 4 times as much. That red bar is about 4 times as long as the orange bar. So this is an inequality reducing intervention, at least on the absolute scale. So that's good news. Now, that dark blue one is the one I've just shown you. That is the effect from tobacco tax, 10% annually increasing 2011 to 2025. Now I'm putting up other interventions. This is what our program aims to do. We are aiming to do 100, 200, 300 interventions in New Zealand, and we're now pulling over 500 interventions from Australia, and we're all putting them up on interactive league scale so you policymakers can have a look. It's not going to decide your policies for you, but it will give you a damn sight better information than you currently have to at least start an informed discussion. So let's look at what you see. Well, a combined tobacco endgame strategy at the top, where you've got tobacco-free generation, that's letting nobody who's born after a certain date ever smoke. You just keep lifting the age you can buy tobacco each year, plus substantive outlet reduction. That gives you a lot of QALY gains. And you go all the way down to the bottom there, and something like dramatically reducing the number of tobacco outlets, reducing them by 95%, won't get you as much, because New Zealand, there's still a lot of access through shops and stuff to getting your tobacco. But it's still worth doing for other reasons. But you can see this huge variation here in the QALYs gain. Nearly done, Wayne. And then I told you I'd talk about salt there. Look at that top one. So the dark blue one here is still the tobacco tax one. Look at this one here. Often not realised, but actually substituting out the sodium chloride and putting potassium chloride into all the manufactured food out there, lowering blood pressure, reducing cardiovascular disease. Even though it's reducing so much, there's still a lot to be gained. You get massive health gains. So we've been recently showing this to the Minister of Health and chief executives at the Ministry of Health and people like that, and they're looking at this going, we've never seen that comparative quantification before, and trying to make people think about this type of thing in their policy making. Last slide, Wayne. So in this one, we're showing what happens over time, to come back to the theme of the Congress on the life course. So you can see time over there in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 decades into the future, all the way up to 2080. And the colours show you the age groups. And you can see here that your gains, and this is classic for public health, it takes a couple of decades for all those gains to come in, because it takes a while to change the incidence, then the prevalence of disease, and then the number of people dying from it, and the population's ageing, yada, yada, yada. Public health is a long-term gain. But a lot of those gains are occurring amongst this group here of your elderly population. So a lot of those gains that we can envisage for these types of interventions amongst elderly. So something like a screening program, you get the gains earlier because you whip out people's polyps. Treatment's often earlier than something like prevention, and tobacco control may be further into the future because you're often acting for young people and stopping them smoking. They are decades away from their heart attacks and their lung cancers. So the summary so far, large potential health gains to be realised through prevention. Moreover, the interventions are population-wide, so something like that SALT across the whole population. The smoking is just benefiting those people who quit because of our intervention, but across the whole population, smaller gains, but it's over the whole population. You get big gains, and particularly for Māori and Pacifica, where they've got higher rates of these non-communicable diseases that you're hitting. However, they often take decades to materialise, and they'll be concentrated amongst the older ages. Is that a good or bad thing? I'll let you decide. And that's all I've got to say, and I need to get out of here and drink some water. Kia ora.